And thanks especially to the campaign group All About Me. That was a brilliant, brilliant film, and I just could really feel everything that he must have gone through, and I imagine, and it's pretty much some of the things I want to talk about, imagine some of the things that he's went through if you had no idea that you were going to go through it at the point at which you probably started making the film. What I want to talk about is basically how myself and David White came to the project, The Violence of Austerity. For David and I, this project started probably about 3 years ago now. You know, it came at a time, obviously, you know, austerity measures were implemented in 2010, about 2 years after the financial crash. And the austerity measures came in under the coalition government. I don't need to remind everybody that we were told that, you know, we need to pay the problem for the public deficit. We need to pay for the national debt problem, not the financial crash or the banks or the private corporations and lack of regulation, but the public deficit problem. So, as we were sort of saturated with a lot of mainstream media and alternative media about how austerity was generating and amplifying poverty and generating further social inequality, especially amongst women, amongst children, amongst people with disabilities. Okay, that media and that information that was coming through was really important about the effects of austerity, but what was also coming through was the harmful impacts of austerity, and that for us was extremely loud, extremely visible, and acute, very, very acute in terms of the physical damage that austerity causes, both in terms of psychological pain, in terms of the physical pain of having your benefits withdrawn, of not being able to access the correct mobility services, etc., healthcare services. So for us, with the violence of austerity, what we wanted to do was say, right, okay, we know violence generates poverty, we know it exacerbates social inequality, what about the violence? How can we document the violent impacts of austerity? How can we articulate austerity as a violent political project? Not just an unfair and unjust political project, but a violent one. So we wanted to shift the debate, and that's where the project started. So in the book we have about 24 chapters, I keep getting confused, 24, 26, but 24 chapters, each of them documenting how austerity impacts specific social groups, people with disabilities, people in healthcare, people with mental health issues, how it affects them in physical and psychological ways. So that was the first crucial aim for us, was to document the violence of austerity. Also for us, what we wanted to do, the second aim of the book was really, how do we start to think about austerity as violent? How do we start to think about any political project actually as a violent political project? So for us in the book, what we wanted to do was to start to shift how we think about violence. That's the first place to start. If we want to understand how a political project is violent, we need to shift how we think about violence. So for us, we wanted to show that with the violence of austerity, and this was coming through to us especially since 2011, with the violence of austerity, people weren't immediately impacted overnight by the austerity effects. Those social groups that are targeted the most, such as women, such as children, such as people on 0 hours contracts, those people who are targeted the most, they don't always see the effects overnight. Normally, if somebody experiences violence, that normally in our minds, the public imagination, is that that violence is an immediate, instant effect. But the interesting thing about austerity was that it was taking effect over long periods of time. So the violence wasn't seen the moment somebody was going to the benefits office and being told about these welfare reforms. The violence was coming a couple of years down the line after the benefit reforms had absolutely taken effect in every way possible and shattering people's lives. So the first thing we wanted to highlight was that the violent effects of austerity, it's like a slow violence. So that's actually an idea that's used in other areas. So we wanted to highlight this idea of as austerity is a form of slow violence. And that slow violence is still happening. The violent effects that we see now as a result of austerity is just really the tip of the iceberg. There's going to be other violent effects that we're going to see happening a decade from now, because it takes place over a long period of time. The other crucial thing we wanted to highlight in terms of shift in how we think about violence was not necessarily to see violence in the way that, you know, we think about interpersonal violence. So obviously if someone harms me, that's a form of interpersonal violence. We wanted to show that where there's violence, there's perpetrators of violence, and it's the exact same with any political regime. Even though we don't exactly always identify politicians as violent actors, they can still be considered as perpetrators of violence. So that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to highlight where, if the violence is happening, if austerity is a violent project, then where is that violence coming from? And how is that violence being enforced, actually? How is that violence being enforced? So what we did was we started to look at the normal, mundane, ordinariness of people experiencing austerity. So we come up with this idea of institutional violence, and the best way to demonstrate institutional violence is to look at I, Daniel Blake. When we saw Ken Loach's film I, Daniel Blake, we were just like, yeah, that's exactly how it's happened. That ordinariness of, that everydayness of going to the benefits offices day in, day out, of meeting a very violent administrative system that can't even give you a simple 2-page form and has to give you a 70-page form instead, causing you all this stress, all this suffering in order to get your entitlement, your very basic entitlement to very basic welfare provision. So we thought that, you know, in terms of the enforcement of the violence of austerity, we realised that austerity is enforced in very mundane ways through very routine administration systems that make it extremely difficult and extremely painful for people to access their benefits, for people to access their rights. So we wanted to highlight that institutional aspect of the violence of austerity. The third aim of the book was to show how austerity is based on a series of deceptions and lies. And, you know, I'm sure you are all absolutely aware of this. The fact that everybody's here, you all know that austerity is based on a series of deceptions and lies. And we highlighted 3 main deceptions in our book. The first deception that austerity is built on is that we all played a part in this crisis, that we all overspent, you know, we all maxed out our credit card, which is just nonsense. The second lie deception is that austerity is necessary, and in the book we showed that it's not necessary. We weren't given a choice about austerity, for those of you that remember. We weren't given any choice, we were just told that this is it, it's a necessary evil, and we showed in the book that it's not. Other countries have taken different routes, and they've been absolutely fine, actually. The third deception is that we're all in it together. And well, we're not all in it together. And that's I just want to focus the next couple of minutes, I just really want to focus on that third deception, that idea that we're all in it together. I'll just read you a quote from our book on that final deception, that third deception, we're all in it together, we put in the book. This political trope is difficult to square with the real lived experiences of austerity and the effects it's having on targeted groups. Austere fiscal policies have been designed in such a way that target the most vulnerable and marginal groups in society, hitting them harder than any other income group. Austerity is a class project that disproportionately targets and affects working class households and communities, and in so doing protects concentrations of elite wealth and power. So what we tried to show was that austerity, we're not all in it together. There's people at the top that are not remotely touched by austerity, and what's more, they're actually generating more wealth from austerity. Meanwhile, there's lots of other targeted specific social groups who are disproportionately targeted by austerity policies. So, for example, women under austerity have been disproportionately targeted in terms of their employment, in terms of income, and also in terms of welfare reforms. When the Big Bang welfare reforms come into play since 2010, and especially since 2013, we've seen especially single parents. We've seen single parents with children no longer entitled to the same levels of income support, and have been changed to job seekers' allowance entitlement, whereas before austerity they were always entitled to income support, and now single parents are having to be seen to be looking for work with parents, lone parents with children as young as 5 years old. So, you know, that brings on all sorts of stresses, and even when, and I think the film really, really powerfully shows, even where the work is there, there's not the childcare. And even where the work is there, it's not permanent work, it's 0 hours contracts, it's all sorts of shift work, that, you know, you can't maintain any routine. You need a job with routine, obviously, if you've got kids. So to make parents with children as young as 5 actively seeking work induces all sorts of pains and stress. And there was a study done by the Fawcett Society, and the Fawcett Society showed that in 2013, a number of lone parents, there was a number of lone parents were given were sanctioned at the same rate as single people seeking on job seekers allowance. So because lone parents obviously can't be seeking work with children as young as 5, and you know, and all of the complications that brings, then they were also being sanctioned. So it was really, obviously, you know, with the welfare reforms, the lone parents have suffered, and I don't need to tell you that the majority of lone parents are headed by those families are headed by women. 86% of lone parent families are headed by women. That's kind of been the trend for the past 30 years. So when the welfare reforms targeted lone parents, actually what was happening was they were targeting women, and they were targeting children too. And I don't need to tell you that the sanctions, and actually the sanctions were introduced under Labour, but it was New Labour, but it was, you know, the coalition government that ramped up the rate and really intensified the terms and conditions of the sanctions. And so what happened was, under the sanctions, obviously, the sanctions, I don't need to tell you, is when you cut your benefits, people have argued having your benefits sanctioned is worse than being, you know, sanctioned or having to pay a penalty through the magistrate's court, because it's so punitive, just having your benefits and all sorts of income completely stopped. The biggest national study on food banks this year found that parents with young children and people with disabilities are disproportionately going to food banks more than any other social group. So in a sense, it's like a race to the bottom, whereby without any, you know, basic entitlement to welfare benefits, we're seeing marginalised social groups being kicked off of their entitlement and going to food banks almost as though food banks are that safety net. I'm not dissing food banks, are absolutely key right now in these times of austerity, but we shouldn't have to be going to food banks, and we weren't going to food banks as much as before the climate of austerity. So when we think about austerity and who it disproportionately affects, we can say that there are certainly social groups that are disproportionately affected more than others. And also when we look at what areas of welfare it affects, obviously it's affecting healthcare, but also austerity, and especially through the welfare reforms, is massively affecting housing. You know, when we think about welfare reforms, I always argue we should have called them housing reforms. When we call them benefit cuts, we should have called them housing cuts. Because when you actually look at the technicalities of how the welfare reforms are implemented, they have a direct, absolutely direct effect on people's housing expenditure and how much people can afford on their rent. And also the same goes for bedroom tax, you know, that comes out of your housing benefit. So lots of people now in welfare reforms are having to make up that deficit in their household rent, where before they didn't have, there was no deficit in their household rent was covered. So in terms of the welfare reforms and the impacts that that's had on housing, I mean, I don't even know where to start, so I'm just going to give you some really important information about the drastic impacts this is having, that austerity is having on housing, and also in terms of in relation to homelessness and also evictions. Because of the welfare reforms and the impact that's having on how people can afford their rent, even their most basic rent, families with 3 children are now at risk to housing associations because of the lack of income they're actually going to have in total in that monthly benefit expenditure. In 2016, we saw about we saw 170 evictions per day in England and Wales, and in Scotland in 2015 and 16 we've seen 1,300 evictions in that year alone in Scotland. And that's not the half of it. This is not the half of it in terms of, these are just figures I'm giving you. The amount of possession orders that are going through courts has absolutely rocketed. Shelter did an interesting report on this based in Scotland, has absolutely rocketed, and that's just in social rented accommodation. That's not even private rented accommodation, that's in social rented accommodation. And it won't come as a surprise that these evictions, these possession orders, these are all being the result of, the main cause of possession orders, the evictions, is due to rent arrears. Before austerity, if people were evicted, especially in social rented accommodation, it's often due to an antisocial behaviour order. Remember that? Antisocial behaviour order. Now it's household rent, now it's rent arrears. That's the main reason why people are being evicted, and social housing associations and private rented landlords, etc., putting possession orders through for eviction. In 2016 in Scotland, the total number of rent arrears across the social rented sector in Scotland amounted to £109 million. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you, when people are made homeless as a result of rent arrears, some local authorities deem them as intentionally homeless. Local authorities have discretionary power, they don't have to be deemed intentionally homeless, but local authorities do deem that, especially where there's a lot of housing competition and housing shortage. And so what's it all about? What is it all about? We've heard about, the results of, families who are evicted who are put in temporary accommodation. The result is there's a huge amount of money. It's a huge amount of money spent on temporary accommodation, especially now when we have such an increase in homelessness and families being evicted as a result of rent arrears. In the past 5 years, from 2011 to 2016, the government spent £3.5 billion on temporary accommodation, and of this figure, Scotland spent £750 million on temporary accommodation. So what's happening? Austerity is not actually making any savings at all, as the government once told us back in 2010 or whenever it was. So in the book, what we highlight the actual cost of austerity. Austerity is a massive national cost if we use temporary accommodation as an example of that. The extra burden that costs on the economy because of all of the shoddy policies that they've implemented. And for us, austerity is a way of dismantling social protection. It's a way of dismantling the welfare state. It's not about saving costs, as the governments have tried to, convince us of. It's not about that at all for us. We can see an increasing dismantling of social protection exercised and manifest through austerity. So that's a very bleak story about the violence of austerity, but I can assure you, and as the campaign group has shown us as well, there's loads of really important, significant campaigns out there that are highlighting to us what we can do in order to address the problem and make everybody, absolutely everybody, aware of those violent impacts of austerity. And I'll end there. Thanks very much.